Documented patrol logs. Authentic visual evidence. Absolute truth. This is Bodycam incident reports.
The free ride is over, buddy. Up and out. This isn't a homeless shelter.
I am authorized to be here by hospital administration, and I am waiting for my transport.
And I'm the Pope. Show me a state ID right now or you're going in handcuffs for criminal trespassing.
At 3:30 a.m., the expansive main lobby of the Mercy General Medical Center was a meticulously designed void of polished marble, brushed steel, and stark, shadowless light. It was an elite, privately funded facility catering to the city's wealthiest residents. The architecture was deliberately constructed to resemble a high-end luxury hotel rather than a trauma center. During the day, the space was filled with administrative staff, patient coordinators, and soft, ambient music. But at this hour, the massive glass sliding doors were locked on night mode. The reception desks were abandoned. The only sound in the cavernous room was the low, steady mechanical hum of the industrial HVAC system, cycling chilled air through the vents, and the faint, chemical scent of institutional bleach mixed with ozone. Before we continue, hit that like and subscribe if you believe in real accountability, and let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from today? Dr. Kenneth Adams sat in the far corner of the lobby. He was positioned in a rigid geometric leather armchair that had been selected by an interior designer for its modern aesthetic rather than its comfort. At 54 years old, Adams was currently experiencing a profound, hollow level of physical and neurological exhaustion that defied simple description. For the past 14 uninterrupted hours, he had been standing beneath the blinding halogen lights of Operating Room 1. He had been staring through the dual lenses of a high-powered surgical microscope, navigating the microscopic, incredibly fragile vasculature of a human brain to clip a deeply embedded aneurysm. It was a procedure the local surgical team had deemed too high risk to attempt. Now, the adrenaline that had artificially sustained his nervous system through the critical hemorrhaging phases of the surgery had completely evaporated. It left behind a brutal, vibrating fatigue. Adams rested his forearms heavily on his thighs. He looked down at his hands. His hands were the primary reason he had been brought to this hospital in the middle of the night. They were instruments of absolute, microscopic precision, insured for millions of dollars. Right now, his fingers possessed a microscopic, involuntary tremor, the physical byproduct of extreme muscle fatigue and adrenaline depletion. He held a cheap, thin paper cup filled with bitter, scalding black coffee dispensed from a vending machine in the basement cafeteria. He let the heat of the thin cardboard seep into the calluses of his palms, trying to force some warmth back into his rigid joints. He did not look like one of the top neurosurgeons in the country. He did not look like a man whose time was billed at astronomical rates. Adams wore a pair of standard-issue dark blue hospital scrubs. They were deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat around the collar. Because operating rooms were kept at a freezing clinical 62 degrees to inhibit bacterial growth, he had thrown his own personal clothing over the scrubs, a faded, well-worn gray pullover hoodie. The hood lay bunched at the base of his neck. He hadn't shaved in 2 days. The stark, unforgiving fluorescent lights above cast deep, dark shadows under his bloodshot eyes. To anyone walking past the glass exterior of the hospital, he looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of imported Italian marble and contemporary art installations. He looked exactly like a vagrant who had managed to slip through the emergency room doors to escape the freezing night air, seeking a few hours of sleep in a quiet corner. Adams blinked, his eyelids feeling like they were lined with fine grit sandpaper. He slowly reached into the front pocket of his hoodie with his left hand and pulled out his phone. He unlocked the screen, wincing slightly as the harsh backlight hit his dilated pupils. He was checking for a message from the executive car service the hospital administration had arranged to take him back to his hotel. The text simply read, "Driver is 5 minutes away. Black Audi SUV." Adams locked the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket. 5 minutes. He just needed to sit in the absolute sterile quiet for 5 more minutes. He leaned his head back against the rigid leather chair, closed his eyes, and took a slow, deep breath, letting the steady hum of the air conditioning wash over him. He did not hear the heavy, measured footsteps of the combat boots approaching across the marble floor until the officer was standing less than 3 feet away. Officer Brian Morris was 45 minutes into his off-duty security detail at Mercy General Medical Center. It was a highly coveted assignment among the city's patrol division. The hourly rate paid by the hospital administration was exceptional. The environment was strictly climate controlled, and the actual security risk was virtually non-existent. His primary duty was to exist as a visual deterrent, ensuring the hospital's wealthy clientele felt entirely insulated from the gritty reality of the city streets outside the reinforced glass sliding doors. He paused near the abandoned main reception desk. He slowly scanned the expansive, brightly lit room, his eyes sweeping past the dormant digital check-in kiosks, the massive modern art installations mounted on the walls, and the rows of perfectly aligned geometric leather chairs. Then, his gaze snagged on a shape in the far corner. The visual dissonance was immediate and jarring. In a medical facility where even the waiting areas were meticulously designed to resemble luxury hotel lounges, the figure slouched in the corner chair looked like a discarded anomaly. Morris saw a faded, bunched-up gray hoodie. He saw a cheap, thin paper coffee cup clutched in dark hands. He saw a man who simply did not belong in the VIP wing of Mercy General. Morris narrowed his eyes and began a slow, deliberate walk across the expanse of the marble floor. As he closed the distance to 30 feet, he noticed a detail that made him pause for a fraction of a second. Beneath the frayed hem of the worn gray hoodie, he could see the distinct, light blue fabric of hospital-issue surgical scrubs. He looked down at the man's feet. The man was wearing specialized slip-on surgical clogs, stained and heavily scuffed from hours of standing. A brief question flickered in Morris's mind. Could he be staff? An orderly? A night tech? But Morris instantly dismissed the thought, letting his street-honed confirmation bias completely overwrite the visual evidence. Doctors and senior medical staff wore crisp white coats. They prominently displayed laminated RFID access badges on retractable lanyards. They did not huddle in the cold corners of the lobby at 3 in the morning, shivering in old hoodies and drinking bitter vending machine coffee. In Morris's mind, the explanation was far simpler. Transients frequently stole discarded scrubs from the open laundry carts near the emergency room loading docks to use as clean clothes. The clogs were likely pulled from a local donation bin. The narrative was firmly set. He was looking at a vagrant who had managed to slip past the outer triage nurses, navigating the maze of hallways to steal a few hours of sleep in the quietest, most comfortable wing of the building. Morris adjusted his posture. He squared his broad shoulders, shifting seamlessly into the unyielding, dominant stance he used to clear corners and confront loiterers in rough neighborhoods. The lobby was vast, requiring a long approach, giving him plenty of time to consider his next move. He had specific protocols he was strictly required to follow as a hospital security contractor. He was supposed to unclip his radio and run a quick check with the overnight nursing supervisor to see if an off-shift employee was in the lobby. He was supposed to walk over to the ER triage station to ask if a patient's family member had been directed to the main waiting area. At the very least, he was supposed to approach from a visible angle and politely ask to see a visitor's pass. Morris deliberately bypassed every single one of those standard procedures. He did not want to gather information. He wanted to exercise his authority. He had already assessed the target, categorized the individual as a nuisance, and decided on the eviction process. Morris approached the sitting man from a blind angle, moving entirely out of his direct peripheral vision until the last possible second. Dr. Adams remained completely motionless, his head leaning back heavily against the leather chair, his eyes closed. He was desperately trying to let his exhausted nervous system reset before his executive car arrived. He was entirely unaware of the armed officer bearing down on him. Morris stopped less than 3 feet away from the chair. He intentionally violated the man's personal space, positioning his heavy combat boots aggressively close to the surgeon's legs to establish immediate physical dominance. He shifted his weight, intentionally blocking the harsh, blinding glare of the overhead fluorescent lights. A long, solid shadow fell directly over Dr. Adams's exhausted face. Morris looked down at the bunched gray hood. He didn't offer a standard, polite greeting. He didn't ask for the man's name or his business in the hospital. He went straight for a street-level ejection. "All right, buddy," Morris barked. His voice was loud, sharp, and entirely devoid of professional courtesy. It was the exact tone reserved for clearing drunks out of bus shelters. "The free ride is over. Drink the rest of that coffee and get moving. This isn't a homeless shelter." The sudden, booming voice of Officer Brian Morris echoed sharply off the polished marble floors, shattering the carefully engineered, sterile silence of the hospital lobby. "Doctor?" Kenneth Adams did not jump. His adrenal glands were entirely depleted. The basic, instinctual startle response that would normally cause a person to flinch at a sudden, aggressive shout had been burned away hours ago over an open skull in Operating Room 1. Instead, Adams simply stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. He slowly opened his eyes, the harsh, ambient glare of the overhead fluorescent lights abruptly cut off by the solid, dark silhouette of the police officer looming directly over him. Adams let his eyes adjust. He saw the dark navy uniform, the glint of the silver badge, and the heavy leather duty belt positioned inches from his knee. He felt the aggressive, intentional invasion of his physical space. He took a slow, deliberate breath, drawing the faint scent of ozone, institutional bleach, and his own bitter vending machine coffee into his lungs. He did not sit up straight. He did not drop his cup. He kept his forearms resting heavily on his thighs, his hands still loosely clasping the thin cardboard. "I just finished a 14-hour surgery," Adams said. His voice was low and quiet, raspy from severe dehydration and vocal fatigue. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, it carried the undeniable, resonant cadence of a man who spent his life commanding a surgical theater, a man accustomed to absolute compliance when he spoke. "I am authorized to be here by hospital administration," Adams continued smoothly, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the officer's face. "I am waiting for my transport." Morris let out a short, harsh breath through his nose, a sound of pure, dismissive contempt. The transient wasn't just loitering, he was delusional. It was a common, desperate tactic on the street. Make up an absurd, high-status lie, acts like you belong in the building, and hope the cop is too lazy to verify it. But Morris wasn't going to let a guy in a dirty gray hoodie talk down to him in the VIP wing of Mercy General. "A 14-hour surgery," Morris repeated, his tone dripping with thick, unapologetic sarcasm. He looked pointedly at the faded gray fabric of the hoodie, explicitly searching for the required laminated RFID access badge. There was nothing. "Right, and I'm the chief of medicine. You don't have a badge, you don't have a visitor's pass. Stand up, put the coffee down, and hand me a state-issued ID right now." Adams did not move. He looked up at the officer's face. He saw the rigid set of the jaw, the aggressive tilt of the chin, the flared nostrils. He recognized the exact pathology of the man standing over him. It was a localized, unchecked ego, demanding immediate submission. In an operating room, Adams tolerated zero ego. He tolerated zero deviations from protocol because a single mistake meant brain death. He was certainly not going to tolerate intimidation from an off-duty patrolman while his own muscles screamed for rest. "I am not required to provide you with identification," Adams stated. His voice dropped into a colder, flatter register, stripping away any attempt at politeness. "I have explicitly stated my authorization to be on this property. I have committed no crime. I am a guest of this medical center, and my driver will be here in less than 4 minutes. Step back." The dismissal hit Morris like a physical blow. Telling a police officer to step back was the ultimate trigger. The refusal to comply with the ID demand was the spark. The calm, authoritative dismissal was the gasoline. Morris's face flushed beneath the harsh lights. The lingering boredom of the night shift vanished entirely, replaced by a sharp, spiking surge of adrenaline. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. In Morris's mind, this was active, blatant defiance. It was a direct, calculated challenge to his authority, delivered by a man he had already categorized as street trash. Morris closed the remaining few inches of space. He planted his heavy combat boots firmly on the marble, shifting his weight into a rigid, combative stance. His right hand dropped away from his chest, the thick leather of his duty belt groaning slightly as he rested his palms squarely on the heavy steel handcuffs secured in their pouch. "You don't give me orders, buddy," Morris commanded, his voice dropping the sarcastic edge and hardening into a flat, dangerous ultimatum. "You are an unidentified male trespassing in a restricted area of a private medical facility. I gave you a lawful order to provide identification to verify your so-called authorization. You are now actively refusing that order." Morris leaned in closer, his shadow completely enveloping the surgeon. "I'm going to tell you one last time," Morris said softly, his tone laced with the promise of imminent violence. "Stand up, put your hands behind your back, and give me your ID, or you are going out of here in cuffs. Choose." Adams looked at the officer's hand, resting heavily on the steel cuffs. He felt the faint, involuntary tremor in his own right hand, the hand that had just meticulously repaired a ruptured blood vessel deep inside a human brain. He knew the legal reality. He knew the hospital's protocols, but he simply did not have the physical energy to de-escalate a man who was actively looking for an excuse to use force. Adams took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee. He lowered the paper cup, rested it on his knee, and looked dead into Morris's eyes. No, the single syllable hung in the sterile, chilled air of the hospital lobby. For Officer Brian Morris, that word was the absolute limit. It wasn't just a failure to comply with a routine directive, it was a total, blatant rejection of his authority in his designated territory. The lingering boredom of the night shift completely vanished, replaced by the sharp, familiar spike of combat adrenaline. Morris moved with the sudden, explosive speed of a man trained to overwhelm resistance before it could fully form. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't shout another warning. He executed a textbook, physical escalation of force designed for immediate pain compliance. His left hand shot out in a sharp, downward arc. He struck the side of the thin paper cup resting on Adams's knee. The impact crushed the cheap cardboard instantly. Scalding black coffee erupted outward, splashing across Adams's faded gray hoodie and splattering violently against the pristine, polished marble floor in a dark, spreading stain. Before the plastic lid even hit the ground, Morris's right hand lunged forward. He bypassed Adams' left arm entirely. He went directly for the hand that was now empty, the right hand. Morris's thick, calloused fingers clamped down aggressively around Adams' right wrist like a steel vise. Adams' eyes widened, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. It wasn't just the sudden shock of the assault. It was the specific, terrifying target. That right hand was the precise instrument that had just spent 14 hours navigating the microscopic, fragile labyrinth of a human brain. It was insured by the hospital's underwriters for millions of dollars. It was his entire life's work, and it was suddenly in the grip of a man who viewed him as street trash. Morris didn't know that. He only knew how to force a body to move. The officer twisted the wrist inward and violently upward, applying a brutal, hyper-flexing gooseneck lock. The mechanics of the hold were designed to stretch the tendons and ligaments of the wrist to their absolute breaking point. It sent a blinding, localized shockwave of pain straight up the forearm, forcing the subject's entire skeletal structure to follow the direction of the pressure. "Get on your feet!" Morris barked, his voice echoing over the sound of the scuffling struggle. Adams had no choice. The intense searing pressure on his radiocarpal joint forced him out of the rigid leather chair. He bit down hard on his back teeth, suppressing a groan of agony. He did not brace his legs to fight back. Any sudden, violent resistance would cause Morris to snap the wrist entirely. Adams yielded to the leverage, letting the heavy officer pull him upright. "You're done talking, buddy," Morris growled, stepping tightly into Adams's back. He pinned the surgeon's bent right arm high between his shoulder blades, maintaining the excruciating pressure on the wrist joint. "Walk, right now." Morris shoved Adams forward. The surgeon stumbled, his scuffed, stained surgical clogs squeaking sharply against the coffee-slicked marble. The officer marched him across the vast, empty expanse of the lobby. They passed directly beneath the high-definition security cameras mounted in the ceiling domes, the dark glass lenses recording every single second of the physical ejection. Morris kept his grip ironclad, occasionally twisting the wrist another fraction of an inch whenever Adams's exhausted pace faltered. Every micro-adjustment sent fresh spikes of agonizing electric pain shooting down into the surgeon's fingertips. They reached the main entrance. The heavy reinforced glass sliding doors detected their motion. The sensors chimed softly, and the doors parted, breaking the climate-controlled seal of the elite lobby. Morris shoved Adams through the threshold and out into the biting, freezing chill of the 3:30 a.m. air. They were in the emergency vehicle loading zone, a harsh concrete expanse illuminated by stark, yellowish sodium vapor lights. Morris didn't stop. He drove Adams across the pavement toward the rough, red brick exterior wall of the trauma wing. With a final, violent shove, Morris slammed Adams face first into the brickwork. The rough masonry scraped against the soft cotton of the gray hoodie and bit deeply into the side of Adams's face. "Do not move a single muscle," Morris ordered, his chest heaving slightly, the adrenaline of the physical altercation peaking in his bloodstream. He kept his left forearm pressed hard against the back of Adams's neck, pinning him to the cold wall. With his right hand, he finally released the agonizing grip on the surgeon's wrist, instantly reaching down to his duty belt. He unclasped the leather pouch and drew his heavy metal-bound citation notepad. Adams slumped slightly against the bricks. He immediately pulled his right arm tight against his chest, cradling his hand. The wrist was throbbing with a deep, sickening heat. A terrifying, heavy numbness was already beginning to spread down through his index and middle fingers, the exact fingers he used to hold a microscalpel. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and ragged, clinically calculating the potential nerve damage. Morris clicked his pen. He stood under the harsh yellow light, staring at the back of the vagrant's head. "You refused a lawful order, you resisted an escort, and you are criminally trespassing on private property," Morris stated, his voice ringing out in the cold night air, dripping with absolute, unquestionable authority. "I'm writing you a citation right now, and if you open your mouth to tell me another lie about waiting for a car, I am putting you in handcuffs and you will spend the rest of the weekend in a holding cell. Do you understand me?" The heavy reinforced glass sliding doors of the emergency loading zone suddenly hissed open, the motion sensors triggered from the inside. Rapid, frantic footsteps slapped against the cold concrete. "Brian! Officer Morris, stop!" The voice was breathless and laced with absolute panic. Morris kept his left forearm pressed heavily against the back of the vagrant's neck, pinning him to the rough brick wall. He turned his head, his right hand still resting confidently on his citation notepad. Mr. Green, the night administrator for Mercy General, was sprinting across the ambulance bay. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, entirely unbuttoned, his silk tie flapping wildly over his shoulder. He was clutching a thick red medical folder to his chest. He skidded to a halt under the harsh yellow sodium vapor lights, staring in sheer horror at the scene against the wall. "I've got it under control, Mr. Green," Morris stated, his voice projecting the calm, authoritative tone of a professional handling a routine nuisance. "Subject was loitering in the VIP lobby, refused to ID. I'm issuing a citation for criminal trespassing and removing him from the property." Green's face drained of all color. He looked from the dark navy uniform of the police officer to the faded gray hoodie pressed against the masonry. "Are you out of your mind?" Green gasped, his voice trembling so violently the words barely formed. "Release him right now. That is Dr. Kenneth Adams. We flew him in on a private medevac 13 hours ago." Morris froze. The heavy, aggressive confidence in his chest vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, sickening drop in his stomach. The adrenaline that had fueled his physical escalation crashed, leaving a cold, hollow void. He slowly pulled his forearm away from the gray hoodie. He took a full step back, the citation notepad slipping slightly in his grip. Dr. Adams did not immediately turn around. He stayed facing the brick wall for 3 long seconds. He took a slow, deep breath of the freezing night air. Then, he slowly pushed himself off the rough masonry. A red abrasion marked his left cheekbone, where Morris had ground his face into the brick. He kept his right arm pulled tightly against his ribs, his left hand gently supporting his right wrist. "Dr. Adams?" Green stammered, stepping forward, his hands shaking as he held out the red folder. "Doctor, I am so incredibly sorry. The post-op protocol for the aneurysm requires your physical signature before you leave the premises. I came down to catch you before your car arrived. I had no idea." Adams looked past the officer entirely, fixing his bloodshot eyes on the administrator. "Give me the pen," Adams said. He spoke with the sterile, detached precision of a medical examiner detailing a fatal injury. Green fumbled in his breast pocket, producing a heavy silver fountain pen. He held it out, opening the red folder to the signature line. Adams reached out with his right hand. His fingers hovered over the silver barrel. A visible, uncontrollable tremor shook his index and middle fingers. The fine motor control was gone, replaced by a deep throbbing numbness from the hyperextension lock. He tried to close his thumb against his index finger, but the joint simply would not respond. Morris stood paralyzed under the yellow light, watching the surgeon's hand fail. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. he suddenly realized the true, catastrophic magnitude of what he had just physically broken. Adams lowered his right arm back to his chest. He reached out with his left hand, awkwardly taking the pen. He braced the red folder against the brick wall and slowly dragged the pen across the paper. The signature was jagged and clumsy. He handed the pen back to Green. "Mr. Green," Adams stated, "as a guest specialist, I was guaranteed a secure working environment. Instead, I was just subjected to an unprovoked battery in your primary lobby. My dominant surgical hand was subjected to a hyperextension lock. You have the entire incident recorded on your high-definition security cameras." Green swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously to the damaged wrist. "If this man is still contracted by Mercy General when the sun comes up," Adams continued, his tone turning to absolute ice, "my legal team will name this hospital as a co-defendant in a gross negligence and premises liability lawsuit." Green's corporate self-preservation instinct engaged instantly. He turned his back on the surgeon and faced the patrolman. "Officer Morris," Green snapped. His voice was no longer trembling. "Hand over your master keys. Hand over your RFID access card. You are removed from hospital security effective immediately. Get off the property." Morris's jaw worked. He looked at the administrator, desperate for an out. "Mr. Green, I was following standard—" "Now!" Green yelled. Morris slowly reached to his duty belt. His fingers were completely numb, heavy with shock. He unclipped the brass keyring. He pulled the laminated access badge from his chest pocket and handed them over. Without the keys and the badge, he was no longer a figure of authority. He was just a liability in a uniform. A pair of bright LED headlights swept across the concrete loading zone. A sleek black Audi SUV pulled silently up to the curb. The driver immediately stepped out to open the rear passenger door. Adams paused with his hand on the doorframe. He looked back at Morris one last time, delivering the final surgical cut. "The hospital just mitigated its liability," Adams said softly. "But you committed a battery under the color of law. My attorneys will contact your precinct commander at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Dr. Kenneth Adams slid into the warm, leather interior of the Audi. The heavy door shut with a solid, insulated thud. The SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb, its taillights fading into the darkness, leaving Officer Brian Morris standing alone under the harsh lights with an empty citation pad, fully realizing his career was over. Officer Morris thought he found an easy target, but he just broke the $1 million hand of an elite surgeon, on camera. No shouting, no street fight, just the cold, crushing weight of a career-ending lawsuit. What do you guys think? Did Dr. Adams handle this perfectly on the spot? Or should he have sued the city for millions instead? Let me know in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of real accountability. See you in the next one.
Our review is now complete. For more unedited field recordings, remember to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching Bodycam Incident Reports.